Sometimes we just don't think praying is powerful enough, or doing the everyday things of living rightly and having a good relationship with Jesus, inflaming our faith, living out our faith in our daily lives with our fellow citizens here.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper. I'm your host for the day. Clarissa Mall will be back next week. Today on our show, Mike Murphy stops by to talk about the latest from the presidential campaign. Then we're joined by Luma Sims from the Ethics and Public Policy Center to talk about the new morality codes established by the Taliban in Afghanistan. And finally, we're joined by Sheila Wise Rowe to talk about how we keep our souls in polarizing times. Stay with us. It's been a busy week in American politics. Joining us for a conversation to catch up on what's been happening and what it might mean is Mike Murphy, co-host of Hacks on Tap. Mike, welcome back to the Bulletin.
It's good to be here.
Russell, you and I talked just before Kamala Harris accepted the nomination to be the Democratic nominee for president. It was a fascinating night. I have to say I was surprised on a couple of levels. One was we got this lengthy teaser of a secret guest, and TMZ was telling us it was Beyonce, and the Swifties in my life were saying, no, it's definitely Taylor Swift. It was an interesting night because here you have this nominee, and you lead up to her with the governor of North Carolina, Leon Panetta, and a Republican, Adam Kinzinger, also a Bulletin regular contributor. What should we make of that night? What were they trying to say with all that?
I started hearing all those rumors too. And I thought, this doesn't fit because the first rule of political kind of agenting, is there's one star and it's going to be Kamala Harris at her convention that night. So bringing the 10 billion watt Taylor Swift or something to me sounded like, that's a stretch. I don't think Stephanie Cutter, who was running the convention, this isn't her first rodeo, so I would be surprised. But I texted her and I said, hey, if you guys do have a big musical guest, a Taylor or something tonight, here's my gimmick for the encore after the big hit song and the confetti with Waltz kind of dancing a little out of beat. Have her whip out the acoustic guitar and steal the Greenwood song, Proud to be an American, and blast it out. Because, with all due respect to Lee, who's been in the business in 1910, the kind of horsepower you guys put together, you'll take the roof off this place. It's an easy song to sing along to, too, and that'll be your big gimmick. And she texted me back 10 seconds later, there is no special guest. This is running way out of control. So I called my wife, who was a Hollywood executive, worked a lot on the Harry Potter stuff. And I said, well, and she goes, no, I just heard from my friend's sister whose brother is the head of Sony Music. A plane has been chartered. And I go, I'm telling you, what do you know? Hollywood's never wrong, the Hollywood rumor mill. So anyway, cut to it's on TMZ then half an hour later. And it was all nothing burger. And I think that's good because she was the star of her convention. That convention, I'll be a critic for a minute, and I'm a raving anti-Trump Republican. I thought the convention won. They had to turn that thing around on a dime from what they were going to do, which was Biden and democracy versus Voldemort, and just pounded Trump to atoms. They had to switch over to the Vibes convention with no time, and they did it really well. So I give them an A for that. I thought the convention had a little too much identity for a while, which is political code talk for don't only talk to the 400 counties you're going to win anyway, widen it out a little. This is why my favorite moment of convention, other than Coach Herr, who I thought was great on the first night, when Tim Walz's old football team came out. Those looks like some of the voters that party needs to get. But they had their wider appeal, folks. They had Republican. They got all their base homework out of the way. Because keep in mind, there's not one room where they say, all right, here's what. They get a list from Schumer. Here are my candidates. Really, you want Bozo Gabanco to speak? To go, yeah, we're, who knows what will happen in North Dakota. We're running them. So you have kind of this list of must-dos. That's like the homework of the convention. You try to get them all out of the way and then have a big somebody each night that moves the message forward. You got the Walt speech, which I thought he did fine. And then they got Kamala up there, and I've seen her not be good. and I thought she did just fine. It wasn't the greatest performance in the world, but it was perfectly adequate. The key is the speech was a work of strategy, which was, one, I'm going to move to the right of Trump on foreign policy. Hey, Putin, yeah, you may give this guy a cupcake and then you think you can invade somewhere, but there's going to be a new sheriff in town with the U.S. military behind her. I thought that was very smart politically of her.
I did too, and I was actually shocked when she started with the strongest and most lethal military and then went through. That was something we haven't heard that way, even from Democratic candidates and presidents who governed that way. I mean, Barack Obama was pretty tough, but he didn't talk that way.
That was a big dog whistle that a lot of dogs heard when the Europeans heard it, because they're looking at increasing defense spending, which is good, because they don't know if Trump's going to turn on NATO. And so that was telling them that, don't worry, we're bringing the old order back. The U.S. is not going to retreat. Through the bipartisan foreign policy establishment, it sent a reassuring message. So what I hear from a lot of anti-Trump Republicans now is we're relaxing a little about her. We still worry about some of her positions. And we're praying the Republicans win the Senate, because if she did decide to go left wing, that would block anything crazy. That's kind of the Republican permission structure to chip him down from the normal 90% of Republicans. He'll need to win most states to, try to push him down to 80 or 81, 79, something like that, which would do him in.
It was fascinating to me watching that last night, because I felt like much of the week kind of leading up to it, it was about the base. It was hyping up the base. It's all about joy. Let's get the Obamas out here. Let's bring out the old guard, Bill Clinton and all the rest. And it was a real significant pivot on that last night. And, I was watching the speech. I was actually texting Russell as I was watching the speech going, I don't know if the speech is working, because it felt like the first 15 minutes or so were kind of slow. It was a lot of biographical stuff. She did sort of two big points, the second half and third half of the speech, and it was where the energy for the speech came from. One of them I felt like we've already covered was the kind of thing that was very much a bridge for conservatives who are looking for an excuse not to vote for Trump. But then the other element that she leaned into in the speech was abortion. I know where abortion is as a national issue. It's a popular issue. She's electorally smart for leaning into it. But I was watching that thinking to myself, this is hard for conservatives. This is hard for evangelical conservatives in particular to hear this and think about bridges. Then you fast forward a couple of days and J.D. Vance goes on, I believe it was Meet the Press, and basically says, yeah, we would veto any law, any national law looking for restrictions. Trump has pivoted so much on the issue of abortion.
And he tweeted that he would protect reproductive rights.
Oh, yeah, look, he's pro-choice. I mean, to him, the life issue is a tool to sell tickets. Think of him like a carnival barker. So it's for evangelical pro-life voters.
But he's not even interested in using the tool this year.
Trump's put, in my view, evangelical, conservative, socially conservative voters in a bit of a pickle, because he's strategically trying to move left on it, but throwing out enough rhetoric to say, give me your votes and trust me. But the other side is, Kamala Harris, strong supporter of abortion rights.
So is he making a bet that his voters, that his base, they really don't care about those issues of abortion, banning porn, all of the socially conservative issues? What they really care about is immigration and race and those kinds of newer culture war issues?
It's that, and his bet is they might not love me, but they hate her, so I'll get the votes anyway. And the problem that Trump guys are having, they had this easy campaign before. Biden's too old and people want to fire Biden on the economy. By 15 points, most polls said that Trump would be better at running the economy than Biden. That was a huge problem for Biden. So now Biden steps aside, and the Trump guys are, now it's Harris was the real mastermind of the economy, but you have 2 years of saying she was not a very involved vice president. And because the tone is so different as they totally hit the accelerator on the convention, she's becoming the change candidate. Trump wanted to be the change candidate. Enough with the bad Democratic inflation and everything, I'll bring us back. But her vibes are also new, fresh. Now he's the old guy. It's muddled up their easy campaign.
They're headed into debate, but we have not really that much time until the election. I can imagine what happens to the Democratic Party if Kamala Harris loses, the various factions vying for control next time. What happens if Trump loses? I mean, this isn't going to go back to Nikki Haley. So where does it go?
the biggest factions in the party. Faction one will be the Chamber of Commerce, Main Street, Rotary, Republican world. They will say, all right, let's get the kooks out and get back in business. Now, they're a little retro. It'll have to be a new and improved version of that. Then you have the national security hawks. They're going to be like, enough of amateur hour with NATO and everything. We got to get back in national security. We got a powder keg in the Middle East. Then you're going to have the nationalists who found Trump useful, kind of the populist. They don't really like the fiscal stuff. It's all culture war. Not like abortion culture war, more immigration culture war, anti-wokeism, all that. That group will try to harness the Trump energy, but they want somebody new. So there'll be kind of a coup in the Trump coalition, kind of a new mini-Trump who's kind of a hybrid. And the social conservatives may say, we're a massive constituency inside this party. Why don't we get out of the faker business and find kind of a modern, non-scary social conservative we think could have wider appeal? There will be fights over state party apparatus, the money, and there probably is a coalition of kind of the business Main Street Republicans. And some of the other groups will want to pull out these Trump people who have been able to take control in some of the state parties. And then there'll be some star we're not talking about who will win a congressional special election. It'll be messy and sloppy and hard fought, but it's necessary. The party has to figure out what it is post-Trump. My argument I make to Republicans, like, I don't know about voting for Kamala Harris. I'm like, look, I'm a conservative. I'm not crazy about a left of center presidency. But one, I don't think she's going to make critical mistakes. Two, she is surrounded by strong people in foreign policy. Three, we're going to win the Senate. That's a hedge in case of trouble. And 4 years of a center-left presidency, to me, is a small price to pay to have a shot at getting a real Republican Party that can compete and win on right-of-center policy like we used to again. So, yes, I'm going to vote for Harris.
So last thing before we wrap up, the other thing that happened this week is Special Prosecutor Jack Smith released a new indictment, basically having sort of rewritten his January 6th indictment to try and accommodate the language from the Supreme Court ruling. There was a really interesting piece by Adam White kind of looking at it. One of the things White says actually is he says, hey, I think maybe some of the reaction to the Supreme Court was a little overheated because they actually kind of created a roadmap for the indictment that Smith just put out there. What he's got is an indictment that's going to hold up should it see time of day. Does it matter at this point? I mean, are people just sort of tuned out on all of this stuff?
I think it's bad for Trump. It's another log on the fire of felon and character problems, which is a Trump weakness. But do I think it's the deciding thing? No. Whoever wins the fight over kitchen table economics, I think, is going to do well. I think what people need to understand is fundamentally what the Supreme Court said is there is certain immunity when you're conducting the duties of a president, the official duties. That's the key thing. And that's where Smith came in, which is, all right, it's time to really figure out what an official duty is. That boundary of what you can declare official is incredibly important legally because that's what you can get away with. And they're trying to restrict that, which is generally historically how it's been done. And that's the road the Supreme Court opened. So this was the first big moment of officially you can't prosecute him for signing a bill Congress passed. But when he's working his own book, so to speak, or trying to, stage a coup, guess what? Not official. It's a good legal offense, and I think politically it's in that loser form, but there are bigger forces at work. If she can make this race, Ted Lasso versus Voldemort, and she is the future and he's old, he's everything you didn't like about 1958, racial attitudes, his attitudes about women, versus she's the center, not scary, and they got work to do on that, but they're trying. Future change. Let's put all this behind us. We've had a decade of hate and avarice in American politics. Maybe we can get on our own team again. She wins that race as long as people think she can manage the economy appropriately. She doesn't even have to beat him on managing the economy. She just can't lose it by 15 points. She can lose it by 3 or 4, even 5. And right now the polling is like a half-baked apple pie. I don't want to taste it. We got to let it churn. I'll be looking at the polling after Labor Day. Back to Russell's point, that debate, or maybe it was yours, Mike, the debate is super important.
Yeah. Well, fascinating moment, fascinating stuff going on. We'll see what happens in the weeks ahead. Mike Murphy, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation.
Oh, always joyful, as Tim Waltz would say. I love being on the podcast. You guys do a great job, and there'll be plenty to talk about next time.
Well, we will be right back. 3 years ago this week, American troops withdrew from Afghanistan, which led to the collapse of that government and the resumption of control by the Taliban, a militant, fundamentalist Islamic organization. Since then, the repression of non-Muslims and of women and girls has become increasingly severe. This week, the Taliban released a new code of laws on the subject of virtue and vice, which severely restrict the clothing, behavior, and public life of both women and men. Joining us to discuss this is Luma Sims. Luma is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where she studies and writes about refugees, immigrants, and human rights, including human rights in the Islamic world. Luma Sims, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thank you.
So glad you could be with us for this conversation. Let me just start at the beginning. What has been happening with women and girls in Afghanistan, in particular, what's happened in the last week or so here?
Well, to understand what's happened in the last week, you probably should go back just a little bit. And that is to remember, first of all, that America was in Afghanistan for 2 decades. And during that time, all gains for women and for girls that were made, allowing them to go to school and allowing them to wear normal clothes and allowing them to have just a sort of a normal human life, were made because of American military force being in the country and working with the Afghanistan government and pushing back the Taliban and their influences in the country. All those gains were lost when America left Afghanistan and the Taliban took over in September 2021. And one of the first things that they went on to do is to stop all education for girls after 6th grade. And in these incremental steps, things have gone really downhill for women and for girls. And so what we now have with those 35 articles that the Taliban put out last week is the full force of these Islamic rules. It's now the Ministry of the Propagation of Vice and Virtue. Under this ministry, there's these morality police, if you will, who now have the job to go through these 35 articles and basically govern the people according to these 35 articles. Also understand that these 35 articles are not just for women and girls. They are the superstructure moral code that is now upon all of Afghanistan's men and women, girls, boys, everybody. The things that stand out, right, are the full covering, top to bottom, of all women. Women cannot leave their house without a male chaperone, and that has to be a male they're related to. Women cannot speak in public. They can't pray in public. They can't sing. The punishments, as I read them right now, could be an arrest from 1 hour up to 3 days, and then for these morality police to decide what to do with them. No schooling, of course. If anybody objects to these 35 articles, first of all, they're to know that these 35 articles are according to Islamic law. And second of all, if anybody objects, that objection is coming out of arrogance. So what the Taliban is doing is sort of right away setting up this thing that says, hey, all you Western people, if you're objecting to what we're doing, you're being prejudiced against our religion and you're acting out of arrogance, right?
You're committing the sin of pride, essentially.
Right. Fundamentally, what you're looking at is dehumanization of the people of Afghanistan, right? What is already happening, what is going to happen is all sorts of, you have these weird permissible spaces where men can do all sorts of things, either to men less powerful or to boys or to children, to women, to girls, that will allow them to eschew any responsibility because the laws are situated so that either A, you could always claim it's the responsibility of the woman because she didn't do X, Y, or Z in order to prevent temptation and or to entice to vice. You can sin against Islamic law all you want in these certain spaces in this really weird and heinous, evil ways and get away with it.
How does this kind of regulation compare to what we see inside other Islamic regimes around the world?
There are a couple of ditches that we should avoid here when we're thinking about Afghanistan and elsewhere in the Islamic world. And one of those is, I think, sometimes because we're motivated to make the apologetic differentiation between Christianity and Islam, and rightly so. Sometimes we have this assumption, well, that's just what happens in Islamic countries and with Islamic people, which when we do that, what we're actually doing is empowering these theocrats and these jihadists to say that's what Islam does. And so you can't be held accountable to the sort of Romans 2 law written on the heart conscience about how we deal with people, human beings, with vulnerable women and girls. And the other ditch, I would say, is not to see the sharpness of the contrast when it comes particularly to Jesus. I think as Christians, we ought to be really struck by the fact we take so many things for granted. And you look at how shocking it is that Jesus approaches a Taliban like treatment of a woman caught violating a morality code, the way he deals with her, the way that Jesus is, for instance, teaching Mary and others, teaching, discipling in a way that just doesn't make sense to a lot of people and was sharply countercultural. I think that moments like this ought to cause us to lament and also ought to remind us, hey, we love Jesus and we ought not to take that for granted.
Historically as well, I think there's something that's important that you're getting at, which is that this kind of Islamic fundamentalism is largely a modern reactionary movement, sort of an anti-modern reactionary movement. Whether you sort of trace it to the Muslim Brotherhood and things that began in the prisons of Egypt in the early part of the 20th century that become this sort of militant vision of Islam that has informed whether it's the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or ISIS or even to a certain extent, the Ayatollahs. The temptation is to say, oh, well, that's just Islam. Islam does these things. But really, Islam was very friendly to the Enlightenment and globalization for a lot of its history. Not to say that it was a proto-feminist movement. I'm not saying anything like that at all, by any means. It seems to me that when we see a movement like this, it probably has more in common, not with the heart and origins of Islam, than with like the Quiverful movement and some of the extreme Christian fundamentalist movements that are also extremely restrictive about the length of women's dresses and bonnets on their heads and who they can talk to and the jobs they can have and can't have and that sort of thing.
Well, yes. I mean, whenever you have a kind of anti-modern angst, sort of a vertigo about the way things are changing, then you add to it a lack of economic stability, or at least the possibility of economic instability. There are always going to be people who are going to take advantage of that. And there is no other way to prop up one's own power better than to claim the mantle of God. And you can see this done with any religion, provided that what you do is to externalize it, which is exactly what Jesus is undoing. Jesus is talking about it's not about what is done on the street corner, it's what is done in the heart, in the prayer closet. That does away with this sense of you need to have the externals controlled. And if the externals are controlled, then you are fill in the blank, because that's where tyrants and theocrats and others, they can get to that. They can't get to the innermost place of the heart, to the actual spiritual transformation, but they can get to the externals. And so they will manipulate them and use them.
Luma, there's been a lot of ink spilled on kind of how we got here. We've talked a little bit about the pullout 3 years ago. And like I said, lots of ink spilled on the rationale for that, ways in which, in many ways, the table was set for that by the Trump administration as well. They were moving towards a different kind of normalization with the Taliban. What can be done now? Is there anything that Christians should be thinking about, or ways we should be thinking about the role of the U.S. in the world in response to something like this?
First of all, we were there for 2 decades, and it required a huge amount of money and blood and firepower to bring a semblance of civility to a country that was really dehumanizing its people. And there's an article that was written by Caitlin Flanagan in The Atlantic back in 2021. She's talking about America. For all of our sins, we are a great country. That's easy to forget. This is not a Republican or a Trump voter or anything like that. But the article is really about the realistic and the difficult situation America finds itself in morally. As in order to do good sometimes, it has to go in there militarily. And so what are you going to do now at this point? Sanctions, UN meetings, UN condemnation and report. The Taliban has already rejected the UN's report. It has already basically said, we don't want your involvement. This is our business. So unless America's prepared to go back in militarily, there's nothing really you can do to force the bully of another country to treat its people well. As Christians, that's another thing. Sometimes we just don't think praying is powerful enough, or doing the everyday things of living rightly and having a good relationship with Jesus, inflaming our faith, living out our faith in our daily lives with our fellow citizens here. And I think there's a disconnect with American Christians in that they don't believe sometimes that faithful actions on the ground every day can have lasting effect, can have miraculous effects, and can have that outward wave of movement to do good to somebody else on the opposite side of the world, right? I strongly believe this because I strongly believe in prayer, and I strongly believe in Jesus Christ, and I strongly believe that faithfulness in the here and now is powerful. But we're caught up in thinking of power only in whether it's in military might or in who gains the White House or all these other things that we really undermine ourselves and belittle the everyday faithfulness.
As I read the story this week, I found myself thinking about another evil empire that was being incredibly destructive to its people in Eastern Europe, and how Pope John Paul shows up in Warsaw and stands up in front of a crowd and says, "Do not be afraid." There's something powerful to speaking truth in these places in subtle, quiet ways that may be much more important than a fleet of B-2 bombers or whatever else. So I think those are encouraging words. Luma, thanks for joining us for this important conversation.
Thanks, Mike.
And we will be right back. Well, these are polarizing times for a host of reasons. How do we stay sane in the midst of them? For a conversation about this, we've invited Sheila Wise Rowe to join us. Sheila has over 30 years of experience as a Christian counselor, spiritual director, educator, and writer. Along with her experience counseling in the States, she spent a decade in Johannesburg, South Africa, where she ministered to homeless and abused women and children. She's the author most recently of Young, Gifted, and Black, A Journey of Lament and Celebration, and has co-authored a forthcoming book called Healing Leadership Trauma. Sheila Wise Rowe, welcome back to The Bulletin.
Thank you.
What I want to talk today about is just this idea that it's no surprise to anybody who's listening to this show that we're living in a polarized moment, and that politics tends to sort of bring out the worst in us. We often sort of externalize that, like, oh, politics brings out the worst in people. But because it brings out the worst in people, it also brings out the worst in us. And I've been fascinated lately by this old language of like keeping our souls, like the work of soul keeping, of caring and curing souls. And so I'm curious, for somebody who has spent decades now, in a sense, like helping people to keep their souls and care for their souls, when you see us as a culture staring down 75 days or whatever it is of a very intense, very polarizing election season, what should Christians who are concerned about the state of their souls, what should they be bracing themselves for, and how can they prepare themselves for it?
I think we're seeing it already. We're seeing that the temperature is really high everywhere. As believers, we have to center Jesus in the midst of the conversations, in the midst of what it is that we're thinking and how we're processing things, and how do we move forward in it. When the Lord said that loving the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, loving your neighbor as yourself. That is core and central to how we're to go forward as believers. The challenge is that given everything that's going on politically, how do we lean into that centrality of our faith? And we have to be intentional about it. This is not something that is just going to happen. We have everything arrayed against us, whether it's the media, whether it's algorithms. There are ways in which we are being pushed into a direction that is about being outraged and everything is on fire and everything is awful. The reality is it's not sustainable. We're seeing this increase in depression, anxiety, this sense of hopelessness, and we're grappling. People are wanting something. They're wanting hope. Being in this place where there's this loss of a vision, what's forward? Where are the anchors, our faith? Where is that at? And so we have to be intentional about it. It's not just about us, though. I think that's really important in that, having spent a decade in South Africa, and there's this term Ubuntu, which is I am because we are. And I really believe that's scriptural as well. It's like we are the body of Christ. But even beyond that, we have neighbors. And so we have to think about what is the impact of how it is that we're reacting, how we're behaving. How is that reacting not only our own souls, but the souls of our neighbors? Whether they're believers or not, we do have some responsibility.
Sheila, I was talking to someone the other day, normally very politically interested and tracking the news cycle, who said, I'm just kind of going to my happy place until after November. And what he meant by that was listening to podcasts that have nothing to do with politics, watching old sitcom reruns that are not going to have any themes that overlap with politics whatsoever, and is just kind of keeping away from everything. Is that a good strategy, or is that a kind of withdrawal that's not likely to make things better?
So I don't want anyone to bypass what it is that they're feeling about what they're seeing because it has wider impact. It's not just about, oh, that's politics and it's out there. It's personal, it's local, it's relational. And so it's really important to really tap into, okay, what is going on for me spiritually? What's going on with my emotions, my mind, even my body? Like, where am I feeling something is off? And what are the things that I need to do? But prayerfully, the Lord knows me. He knows you. He created us. He knows the specificity given our own histories. And so to listen to the Lord and to ask, what is it that I need? And maybe it is a movie. It could be old TV shows. It could be whatever. But at the same time, it can be other things. And it also can be being active and engaging politically. But it's the scripture about taking every thought captive and making it subject to Christ. Literally, that's thoughts and actions and saying, Lord, here, what do you want me to do in light of this?
A lot of our audience are pastors and church leaders of various forms. And it's been a hard few years for pastors and church leaders. And that's not just anecdotal. I mean, there's really solid data. Barna does this research called The State of the Pastor that has showed a number of markers indicating that pastors are going through a difficult time right now. And more pastors want to leave or are frustrated with their ministry or are frustrated with their congregations. And what I often hear from pastors and church leaders too is that they feel like they're in a can't win situation. Half their church will be really upset with them if they say, I'm not going to focus on the political, I'm going to focus on the gospel, and people feel like they're abdicating their role. And then the other half is angry when they talk about politics because they feel attacked because they feel their favorite politician or their party or whatever is under attack. And that can change given the issue and given the week and all the rest of it. You have a book coming this fall about healing leadership trauma. I'd love to talk a little bit about that. First of all, what is leadership trauma? And does that language help describe some of what we're seeing in the church in the last few years in these very polarized times?
Leadership trauma really refers to the way in which a leader is having to juggle various states. So, one is the pressure of the past experiences, and those past experiences can go all the way back to childhood and how that informs how that person leads. It is influenced by the present. So, some of the pressures that you talked about that pastors are facing right now. And then it's also about forward in terms of there's often in some ways hopeful, but then in other ways fearful that either there's going to be a repeat of a past scenario, or that this person has this sense of, in a lot of anxiety and fear, am I being set up for failure? And all of these kind of conflate to a leader really having to carry all of that and then lead a body of people who are at various points happy or angry or maybe disinterested, but they can follow the entire spectrum. And so what we're seeing with a lot of those that you talked about, the research, is that there is a heavy load that leaders, and it's not just pastors. This book is for Christian leaders in any kind of capacity, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever, that we're juggling all of these. And partly it's because as believers, we're hopeful that we're somehow bringing light into the work situations, whether it's in a church or elsewhere. And when we're having to carry all of these competing experiences and feelings, it's easy to devolve into, I've got to just perform and do what people want me to do, even though I'm not all in. I need to say something, or I don't need to say anything, even though internally I feel like I should say something. And so that creates a great deal of anxiety and fear. And it affects the leader, but also the leader's family, the community, everyone around them is impacted by that. And I think that a lot of what we're seeing with leaders who have fallen, and some of them were just absolutely shocked because it feels like it's out of left field, is often because we have leaders who don't have those spaces where they actually can say, I am struggling. And to actually have people that, it's a safe enough space where they can begin to process stuff. In some ways, they're on edge, and I'm not giving them any excuse. But if they don't have a place to begin to process what that is all about, how historically even their childhood is informing their current behavior, they're going to continue in that behavior, or at some point, it's not sustainable. It is going to blow up.
I've talked to a lot of pastors and other leaders who have said, maybe it's somebody who's in a parsonage right next to the church, entire life is built around the church, kids there in school. And the leader says, if I were to get up and say, hey, everybody, I need a little bit of time because I'm struggling here, there would be a faction within the church that would say, see, he's cracking up, and would actually use that as a weapon against the leader. And so they feel as though they're in this trap of having to pretend like everything's okay. Where do you go when that's going on?
The pastor leader has to go outside of their primary constituency. So they're going to need to go into individual therapy. There are groups out there that are confidential. And then I think that, the many denominational leaders need to really look at, how do we offer that level of like soul care to our leaders? So if a leader can't get it within their church and they can't be vulnerable, and I agree, in most cases, probably not, they need to be able to see a therapist and to be serious about it and to have some serious accountability. There has to be a real grappling with what led the person to that place and what needs to happen in terms of healing, and really working with someone to look at, how do you go forward, or should you go forward in ministry?
There's a counselor friend of mine who has this phrase. It's haunting to me, but he brings it up all the time. And he often says it like when someone will tell him a story of a pastor that he knew or they knew that has recently gone through some kind of moral failure, he'll often shake his head and he'll say, the soul finds a way. And what he means is the soul finds a way to get the rest that it needs. It'll blow up your life by doing something disqualifying. If you want to use more therapeutic language, the subconscious is creating a situation in which the pressure is going to be relieved one way or another. I mean, ministry is always a pressure cooker. But I think there's been something about, like, whether you want to talk about the COVID years or the Trump years or whatever the issues were, the church has been going through a season where it's been deeply divided, and it's an incredible pressure cooker. So this idea that in the midst of that pressure, Christian leaders would feel the temptation to kind of find the escape hatch, whatever it might be, even if it's something totally irrational, it makes so much sense to me.
The Lord loves them so much not to leave them in their junk. And so, yes, it is internally, there's this silent scream, and then ultimately things blow up. because the person really needs to get back on track. But I believe it's a severe mercy for the Lord of just saying, the Lord loves us so much that to leave us in that junk, he's not okay with that. The Lord really is, in some ways, I believe, kind of pushing us and giving us multiple opportunities along the way to go a different way. And then at a certain point, it's just kind of, well, that's it. And we see the blowups.
Well, and that's a really good point about the scream metaphor, because it seems to me that that is the argument of Romans chapter 8. The way that we move from the way of the flesh to the way of the spirit is not through some sort of mapped out strategy, but through the spirit that cries, Abba, Father, and groans along with the creation, sometimes with groanings too deep for words, finding a way to express what it is that actually is awful rather than just willing it away and wishing it away. It seems to me that's deeply, deeply embedded in a Christian way of seeing things.
So, for the season ahead, for pastors who want to keep their souls as well, are there any sort of core essential practices that you could encourage listeners to say, like, hey, here are ways to stay rooted, stay connected to the person and presence of Christ, to not let this stuff consume you?
I referenced it before about really checking in with where you at and then bringing it to Christ. So being intentional in prayer, of going to the Lord with exactly how you are. The Psalms are just full of examples of that, of just King David going to the Lord and just saying what he needs to say. And so we need to do that. I think the other place is really being intentional about looking for where is the Lord moving. And I want to say that even in where's the Lord moving, like we can somehow even contort that to kind of fit in with our political perspective or whatever. But it's really looking at the historical Jesus in the scriptures and how did Jesus actually interact with people? How do we see that? How do we see God moving? Like he is still moving, he is still touching people. He is even working through you to bless people, to pray for people. I think that's really essential. The other part is just rest. Sandra Dalton Smith has a great book about rest, like all the forms of rest. We need that because the anxiety level and the pull to get on your screen in the morning and look at the news and spend hours on social media. And so where do we need to pull back and rest? And then lastly, because it's not just all about us, where do we need to serve? And there are lots of opportunities to do that, where it just becomes more than just about me. It's those who are in need and reaching out to them. And there's something that blesses us, our soul. But also, God says, if you did this for the least of these, you did it for me.
Sheila Wise Rowe, thanks so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for listening. We will be back next week.
The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.